Pharm So Hard, the employees wanna find me, and then wanna hire me. What's 100K to a guy like me? Could you please remind me? Pharm So Hard, this ain't easy. Working late nights, you best believe me. My grades can only go A's. Never wanna see another B unless I'm Jay-Z. Pharm So Hard.
What's up, I'm your host, Jim Pruitt, aka PharmD Easy, and I'm bringing another episode of the Pharm So Hard Podcast. We have another special episode in the end of our Tox month. It's going to be phenomenal, guys. And we may actually drop this a little bit after July, but hey, who's counting? Everyone loves Tox, right? So we have another one of the friends of the pod coming back to chat with us. And this time, we're talking about the drug that most people say wrong. I'm probably going to say wrong. You probably said it wrong as well. I'm going to try to be, extra, bupropion, or really Wellbutrin. We've been talking about that today. But I got my man, Thom Mac, coming back with us. Go ahead again. If people didn't listen to the first episode you had, go ahead and give them just a quick intro for you, and let's dive right into this thing.
Yeah. Thanks, Jimmy. My name's Thom Mac. Some of you guys follow me on Twitter at Tommy Tox. I just finished up my toxicology fellowship here in Tucson, Arizona. I'm sticking around currently to do some things with danger noodles, aka rattlesnakes. And so I'm here today to talk some more about tox, and stoked to be here. And I mean, you can't say bupropion. If you say Wellbutrin, I'm going to say Illbutrin. There's nothing good about it, but however you go with it, potato, I guess.
That's dope. Again, thank everyone for kind of coming on. Quick reminders again for you guys that are just following us. A lot of what we've been building over the last few years at the Empower RX conference has been phenomenal. We're in the process of building that right now. We got some pretty cool things we're planning on doing. If you want to know, reach out to me. I'll let you know. So again, we're going to be building something pretty cool here. So go check us out at empowerrx/conference.com. If you don't know what that is, or just Google EmpowerRx, we're the only one. And then when coming to what we're moving forward with doing, again, my focus is on education, and our sister company, Pharmacy and Acute Care University, is helping people when it comes to continuing education, board certification prep. But again, you guys can check that out. I want to jump into Wellbutrin, or AKA Illbutrin.
So we'll dive right into it. It's bupropion or Illbutrin or whatever you want to call it. It's one of those things people in toxicology love to hate. So it's an antidepressant. It also gets used in smoking cessation, weight loss, ADHD. It's been used for compulsive eating disorders. Mechanistically, it's a weak reuptake inhibitor of dopamine, norepinephrine. Its structure is kind of similar. It's basically a substituted cathinone, also known as bath salts, or you can think of it as an amphetamine with a keto group beta position for all the kind of nerds out there. It's also why it commonly trips the UDS positive for amphetamines. So you have that there too. But if you wonder why people feel good on this stuff, well, who wouldn't feel good on amphetamines? Mm-hmm. And so this stuff came around in the late 80s. It was produced in an immediate release formulation. They found that there was a small group of people that were having new onset seizures at therapeutic doses. It was less than 1% of people. So the FDA said, well, okay, you guys got to slow your roll. They took it off the market. The company went back, they invested all that money into it, and they reformulated it. And so they reformulated it, and we have a sustained release formulation, and we also have an extended release formulation now too, which seemed to kind of lower that seizure risk that was worrying everybody.
So again, that's a good background to kind of get us going with this. Because again, I had a patient today that was on Wellbutrin, and she was screaming, "I need my Wellbutrin. It makes me feel well." I was like, "Oh, that's a good marketing tactic to kind of go from that." But of course, we definitely have some issues. So again, we know how it works from a traditional standpoint. But then you mentioned, again, let's get toxy here. Let's kind of jump into that. Let's talk about toxicity. And so how does, bupropion or Illbutrin becomes harmful in these overdose situations? And can you kind of talk about some of the science behind it, the mechanisms behind all of that?
Yeah, I can give you what I know. So we have the seizure risk stuff, and I can't really give you a definitive mechanism for that. I'm really sorry. But it may be similar as to, when you have folks who have large ingestions of amphetamines, or cocaine, stimulants, things along those lines. You basically just get large amounts of catecholamines in the CNS, strain up excitatory action. And then, we know bupropion has several metabolites. So people have looked at whether is it the bupropion parent metabolite, is it the active metabolite, hydroxybupropion. But we don't know which one's truly the culprit for these seizures. And these seizures are really, they're weird because they can occur, they can be conjured up by taking 1 or 2 extra of your daily dose. If, your daily dose is 300 to 450 milligrams, it only takes 1 or 2 extra to really get you there. And, now we have these different formulations. We have the SR formulation, which has, a half-life of about 12 hours. And then we have the extended release, which is about 21 hours. Typically at these, doses, when you're just getting like 1 or 2, extra from your therapeutic misadventure or whatever, the seizures tend to be, they tend to terminate on their own. They're not as bad. When you start getting into a couple of grams, you're increasing that risk for repeated seizures. And they, now we're using more benzos. And if you get even higher doses than that, and like, let's say we'll throw a number out there, greater than 9 grams, now you're talking the potential for fatal outcomes, because now you can get these repeated seizures that will happen over and over and over again that can be hard to treat. And they can lead into these like really violent malignant arrhythmias. But I'll stop here just for a second, just because, we talk about these seizures things, and it's like the big thing we talk about with this stuff. But when we get into these overdose situations, it's probably like, it depends on the literature where you look, about 30% of the time. That's a pretty big amount, and it's definitely not a small number, but around 30% of the time, it's pretty likely. And then it does some other like really weird stuff too. I've seen it, I've had patients that look profoundly anticholinergic, and we didn't know what the exposure was, and we gave Pfizo, and it like, patient did not seize. And it's beyond me, like the fact that didn't happen. I was like, whew, but we get this GC mass spec a couple of days later, like, hey, it was bupropion. We're like, oh my. So you're like, wow. And I've had patients that look really serotonergic, and this drug doesn't really have any appreciable serotonergic activity. They're having hyperreflexia, they're having clonus, they're having, all these things. So bupropion, it just has this like, this tricky, taunting, ambiguous behavior. And that's one of the, there's reason number 9 why I hate it. And then, we get into this other thing. The other big concern that a lot of folks are really worried about is the cardiovascular toxicity. And, Jimmy, you may have like read the case reports, maybe even seen them. And even for our listeners out there, they may have, had one before. They're awful. But they're pretty rare when you think about it, when you look at the numbers. But you need a very large dose in the right person at the right time. And they're awful because once they take off, they are nasty. They are a train in movement, and they are hard to stop. We're talking about hypotension refractory to, combination in large doses of norepi, epi, vasopressin, phenylephrine. And people start throwing things like methylene blue, hydroxycobalamin, everybody hates albumin, and then that gets thrown in there too. It's just, the cardiovascular collapse seems unstoppable. And then, if you didn't have that, the other way it can go is it can go into like very malignant ventricular arrhythmia. And so, how does that happen? How does this cardiac toxicity come? So the QT can become prolonged, and that's just due to the inward rectifying potassium channel. It's not terribly potent, and we don't really see a whole lot of torsades in these overdoses. So it's kind of uncommon from that standpoint. But the QRS does prolong, and that's what's usually driving these like kind of like horrid fatal arrhythmias. Now, like, we talked about in the last episode with toxic alcohols, we're talking about bicarb. When you see that QRS prolonging in tox, we think bicarb. All right, let's give some bicarb. We'll push some bicarb. And so we want to deal with that sodium channel blockade, and that's how we do that in tox. When these ODs started becoming more frequent as time, went on through the 90s into the 2000s, what they started to see was bicarb wasn't doing anything for the QRS. It wasn't shortened. So what happened? And so, when you want to figure out anything in tox, you start, experimenting on animals and killing animals. So that's what they did. So they went to the bench top. They did an animal study where they took an isolated guinea pig heart and they threw a ton of bupropion at it. And so what the study suggested is these things called cardiac gap junctions, specifically a specific protein called connexin 43 was being inhibited and blocked. And that was responsible for this effect. And so everybody's like, all right, huzzah, we have the answer. And however, there was another study that came out shortly, years later after, and it just showed this not to be the case. And so in the midst of all this, we've also had people that have given bicarb and they have seen the QRS shorten. And so it's like, okay, we we still don't really know. I've certainly had cases where I've seen it work, and I've had cases where it doesn't. And so this is its ambiguity and its pathway of toxicity. And it's another reason why I hate it. So, if you asked for me to give you the mechanism and I gave you a big, I don't know. So sorry, man.
But it's good to know that, because I think sometimes we like to think that, oh, we know this stuff and we don't. Like, how does Tylenol work? Well, there's a few things. Oh.
Kind of like Joe Dirt. It's like, why are rainbows good? I don't know, just is. Like,
yeah. Here's one of those things, and it seems to me, is like I like to categorize medications based off like other things. Like, it seems to me like, Wellbutrin is like, the CNS version of like valproic acid, because it's like super dirty everywhere. We don't necessarily know how, or it's like an amio. It's like a mixture of like amio and valproic acid, just dirty everywhere. So it's my way to think of like, hey, I had a nurse ask me, what do you mean the drug is dirty? And I was like, oh yeah, I probably should explain what I mean by that. But it's cool to kind of know kind of the talks of that stuff. And you mentioned it a little bit, but like some key things that come in, we don't have talks right at bedside with us, what are some key clinical presentations that you can think of that can make you, at least, I should say, make you think that it could be potentially this?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of things. And keep in mind of what the drug is. Like you said, it's dirty. And it's just a dirty amphetamine when you think about it. So regarding these seizures, a lot of folks have done a lot of studies, whether it's poison center studies or whatever you have. There's some isolated symptoms to watch out for, and they may clue you that a seizure is about to hit. And so some of those is tachycardia greater than 100 beats per minute. They're showing any kind of tremors, agitation, hallucinations, altered mental status, QTC greater than 500. There's been a bunch of things, but clinically, just when you think about it, we're causing increased CNS, just excitation. And so think about, your vital signs. So like I said, your heart rate, tremors, agitation, those things, that can tell you that a potential seizure is on its way, just increasing that. When we're talking about warning shots from the cardiovascular toxicity that might be on the way, as pointed out earlier, we talked about the QRS and QT prolongation can be a sign that a cardiovascular event could or might happen. And remember, cardiac toxicity is very likely to be due in the case where you have a very, very large ingestion, like several grams of bupropion. And there was a really nice study recently out in ClinTox that Simpson et al. Published. And they looked at National Poison Center data system. And what they found was, folks with older age, seizure, a wide QRS, and a prolonged QTC was associated with adverse cardiovascular events following intentional bupropion ingestions. Both these things that we have for whether it's seizure or cardiovascular tox, it's kind of the best of what we have right now. And that's kind of a mix of what I kind of consider when I'm looking at these folks.
Absolutely. So I think it's good to just kind of have some picture of that too, just that when they first come in. So it's like, okay, we might be getting a seizure coming up here pretty soon. So anything else we can see before we start moving into like how do we treat it?
Other than I always harp on things like history and tox, get as much information as you can. And, what I want to know in the history with these substances is, when did the ingestion occur? How much did they take? what was the formulation, and the formulation is key. So you can check the last refill. Sometimes there's empty pill bottles, sometimes there's refill dates, but we want to get an idea if this is going to be a large ingestion or not, and then where are we in this potential timeline of toxicity. And while I'm trying to sort the history out, we're getting IV access, we're getting them on the cardiac monitor, we're monitoring their vitals, get an EKG, send off, it's always reasonable to send off a metabolic panel, always in tox. I always harp on this, get an acetaminophen level and a salicylate level. We always check for those in intentional ingestions, start maintenance IV fluids, and then just start really in on ABCs. Talk about airway, breathing, circulation. Start simple and start with what you're seeing with the patient in front of you. We do have some specific therapies, and I'm guessing you want to hear about those next.
Absolutely, because I think that the biggest thing people read about that they're commonly, I think the most wrong about more frequently is going to be gastric decontamination. Like, it's a cool thing for us. We want to do all these different components, and the time frame is, debated amongst toxicologists about, is it 30 minutes? Is it an hour? Is it 2? Is it 4? I don't know. I just call tox and you tell me, hey, should I squirt this black charcoal down this person's throat or do something else? So talk to us about the gastric decontamination. It's a cool thing, and I think it's something we should know. What should we do with these patients?
Yeah, so GI decon is like one of those things that, in theory, it sounds really great. And it sounds like it's the thing that is the answer. And, when you look at, we've studied activated charcoal for years and years and years. And, there's just not a lot of compelling evidence to say we should be giving it every single time because it does the right thing every single time. If you want to, hear a brief cool story about where did activated charcoal come from, it was a pharmacist that invented this stuff. And so he wanted to test this stuff out. And so in front of a group of peers, he essentially ingested a bunch of strychnine followed by activated charcoal. He did not die. So that's where we got, leave it to a pharmacist to do some baller stuff.
But did you die?
Yeah, but
That's where it came from.
And he did not die. So when we're thinking about, GI contamination and timing, you're bringing up all these great points. I talked about the different formulations too. So we have these sustained release, we have these extended release formulation. And with large ingestions that we talk about toxicokinetics, which are just the kinetics of the drug, the change in, a toxic overdose, rules get thrown out the window. So this is unpredictable. The toxicity can be prolonged and persistent. But let's say, you have a you have a fairly large ingestion in front of you. It's massive. We're talking higher gram amounts. Let's say, once again, we're talking about greater than 9 grams and beyond. And this ingestion occurred within the last, few hours, 2 or 3 hours. Gastric decontamination should be considered, with activated charcoal, plus or minus whole bowel irrigation. If you're going to do activated charcoal, you need to make sure your patient has a functioning GI tract. There's no concerns for obstruction. They're protecting their airway. And most importantly, the patient has to be willing to take this as well. And you have to remind yourself that if this was an intentional ingestion to harm themselves, you're telling them they have to ingest this really gross, nasty stuff. So you have to have all those things. And the last thing you want to be dealing with the patient, that's aspirated a bunch of charcoal into their lungs. This is not good. This has led to complications, and this has led to deaths in some patients. So you got to be careful. And then we have whole bowel irrigation that can be considered too, and that's a ton of fluid. We're talking like 1.5 liters or 2 liters, up to 2 liters an hour has been done. That's a lot of fluid. But if you're going to be doing activated charcoal, a couple of key points that I always like to throw out there is give the first dose with sorbitol. We know that sorbitol is hyperosmolar, and that's going to get the GI tract moving, and that's what we want in this case. So I will give a dose with sorbitol. If I give activated charcoal, one of the things I like to do is pre-treat with an antiemetic, because once we said the last thing we want to do is to have something come up that we don't want come up and go into the lungs. So whatever your antiemetic of choice is, I like to give something like that to avoid this vomiting and aspiration scenario. And then make sure the head of the bed's elevated. They're sitting up. This is all part of what you need to pay attention to, the little fine details. And then if you have these large injections, we talk about multiple dose activated charcoal. They do advocate, some folks do in Goldfrank's, they do mention, multi-dose activated charcoal. And what you would do with those following doses is you do them without sorbitol, and then you can space them out every 6 to 8 hours, and you might be giving anywhere from 1 to 2 to 3 extra doses. It depends on the toxicologist and the situation that you have. And then with the activated charcoal, you can mix it with juice, you can mix it with soda. I think there was a group of pharmacists who did a study back in the day, and it turned out that what was it? It was Fresca. It was like it worked really well with this stuff. Put it in a cup, put a cap or a lid on the cup, and give them a straw. They don't need to see the black sludge. And try to make this, a positive experience, so you can get them to actually get this stuff down. And then on to whole bowel irrigation. I call it the wet and wild. I've done it a few times. It's basically a way to clear out the GI tract, flush the bupropion out is what we're trying to do here. And as I said earlier, it can be a lot of fluid. At some point, it may be too much for the patient, and they may vomit. That's your cue to back off and slow down on the intake with that. And the other, I can't mention, make sure you have this. I can't say this. This is a very important thing. Make sure you have a bedside commode, okay?
Yeah.
Things are going to have to be coming out. Otherwise, if you do not have the bedside commode, you're going to have a very upset nurse with you. So make sure that is present. And the way we kind of like titrate, is to basically clear effluent. Clear fluids in, clear fluids out. And that's, what we're looking for in the end game when we're trying to flush those out. But, like I said, we have these modalities. I wish I could tell you that we have great mortality data in front of us, but if you have a very large and dangerous exposure in front of you, and, these are treatments that, hey, we might as well give this a shot.
Absolutely. I think that one of the things I always ask, and I say, hey, is there a cutoff for you? Like I always ask, what is the cutoff for activated charcoal? Like what, if it's 4 hours and they saw the person taking, you have a confirmed 4 hours or 3 hours and 56 minutes. Is that you're like, go ahead. Or is it like, absolutely not? Because I've seen two opposite ends of the spectrum from toxicology. What is the window for you? I know 2 hours, absolutely.
Yeah. Within 2 hours is quite reasonable. When I'm thinking about a very large ingestion, I'm probably okay with within 4 to 6 hours. And there are some toxicologists that will go further out. And, when you get these folks to get really hypotensive and you're jamming all these pressors on them, right, and all these inotropes, they're not perfusing their bowels. So at some point they have a whole bunch of drug in their gut slowly releasing. And since they don't have good perfusion to their gut, this stuff is just sitting there. As soon as perfusion does get better, what happens is the toxicity comes rip-roaring back around again, because now you got all this drug that's leaching out. There's been some folks, that will advocate maybe later on giving a dose, but I would say within, 6 hours, and we're talking big dose. It's, you're going to get a different answer from every toxicologist. Yeah. So, yeah.
I think just having the variability to say, okay, we can do this. This data's not great, across the board. But could it be something that could be beneficial? Can it hurt if you have a patient that's awake, sitting up, you have the staff, you have enough of the drug there? Is it going to hurt? Personally, I haven't seen as many issues in the right patient. So if I have the right patient, I'm recommending it. Even to where I have some toxicologists like, oh, it's been an hour or two. I'm like, fam, it's not going to hurt. So again, we can do everything else, but I want to throw some activated charcoal on there. Just to, again, we saw the guy take the drug. So it's one of those things I want to look at.
Yeah. And I've had colleagues have cases where, they've had deaths, and, when they go do autopsy, we know that, bupropion and these formulations can produce a ghost shell in your feces. So, that you may see the ghost capsule, but there's actually no drug in it. I've had, a toxicology colleague that said, they inspected the bowel afterwards and they pulled out a ton of bupropion, and there was plenty of drug in these things still. So, that's why, it depends on which toxicologist you talk to, because it depends on what case they actually had, and they had a really bad outcome. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So we really hit that big part. That was intrigued about it. I think that's controversial. When we start thinking about start moving into like the specific treatments. Can you discuss any specific, not necessarily antidote, but treatment that you would use in managing these patients, and what considerations should we bear in mind when using them?
Yeah. So I got two that I immediately think of. One drug. First one is cardiac toxicity or hypotension is going on, and you've been running impressive doses of inotropes and vasopressors. And so using intralipid or 20% lipid that you'll have in the pharmacy, the theory of this benefits from anesthetic toxicity, which it works really good for, primarily bupivacaine. The thought is that the source of the fuel of the shocked heart has had this pathway of energy metabolism inhibited or blocked by the overdose. This heart prefers lipids as an energy substrate at baseline. By giving lipid, it's thought that it provides the starved heart with that preferred energy substrate. The other hand of this, or the other mechanism that's been kind of teased out, is you may have heard this, the term called lipid sink pathway or lipid sink theory. And this is basically in the process of which the lipid is sequestering the drug away from the potential site of toxicity. And this is in the event that you have a very lipophilic substance or a lipophilic drug that you can look up. You can go look for a drug's log P, and that'll give you an idea if it's lipophilicity. And the larger the number, the more lipophilic it is. But when you look at these things, we don't have, like in tox, we don't have a lot of great reports. We know it works really well for anesthetics toxicity, but there's been a lot of reports of bupropion. It is advocated for it in certain circumstances, as I mentioned before. But we have to recall, reporting bias or case report bias, where we get these positive case reports or say, hey, it worked really well in my patients, but for those like 10 or 20 case reports it was good in, there was probably 1,000 other cases where it didn't work out for the patient. So we have to watch out that kind of the bias. The use of intralipid gets reserved as kind of a last line option. And it's probably, your only option if you don't have the next treatment that I'm about to talk about. So the next treatment we talk about, it isn't a drug, and no, it's not going to church and praying. It's the next option is VA ECMO, and this is for the patient that's exhausted all these drugs, all these like quote unquote antidotes. ECMO gives the opportunity to augment and support the heart and the lungs to oxygenate and circulate blood. And it does this as a bridge to your own body's, metabolizing and eliminating the bupropion from your system. And as the theory of how this all works is, as the drug is being eliminated, the requirements for all these inotropes and pressors, these are decreasing, and then eventually the ECMO can be weaned and stopped. If you have a patient that you expect to potentially get this sick and you believe it is a massive ingestion, one of the things that I consider off the bat is, consider, do I need to transfer this patient to a center that has these capabilities? Because I would tell you, it's very difficult to transport them when they're really sick, and you have a helicopter coming. If you have ECMO at your facility, give the ECMO team the heads up, like, hey, we have this serious ingestion, and asking them, each facility is going to have different criteria for starting ECMO, for cannulating a patient and getting them started. So it's always good to have that conversation with them before things hit. I've had patients die, like, en route to trying to get to an ECMO facility. I've had them die in a helicopter pad. These are bupropion exposures too. I'm not talking about all my toxic exposures. Like, I hate bupropion because it's, I've lived in the Northeast, the Midwest, and now the Southwest, and bupropion just keeps following me around everywhere. And I've had one successful patient that was a younger patient that got started on ECMO probably around 8 to 10 hours after the exposure, and they made it out with 0 neurological sequelae, which is that's a rare win and a rare finding for me, because when you talk about ECMO, I won't go into what it is, the specifics of it, but for those of you who know what it is, and for those of you who don't, go take a look, go read up on it. It's a very invasive thing to do, and there's a lot of risks that do come with it, but it is a potential, this is a potential last line therapy that may work.
Absolutely. So again, I've finally got to a shop where we're cannulating people in the ED now. So it's just wow how crazy things can get. And this is something that people, when it's a big toxic overdose, and it's like, hey, we have tox on board, we have different people here, we have us at the bedside. So something that we have to keep in mind and say, I know it's not necessarily our place, but again, this is what we've seen. We have a little bit of data with this. So out talks, but I think we should probably have conversation. So that's usually how I play these scenarios. So, hey, it maybe should be a conversation with a young, healthy person that's like a couple hours out. So it's definitely something to look at into. Now we mentioned ECMO and lipids. The biggest thing that everyone loves to talk about is the seizure component. Can you just very briefly just throw, again, seizure management, and then let's kind of jump into some of the patient monitoring and supportive care. We can shut it down for today.
Yeah, sure. Seizures are simple. GABA A agonists. The first line, we love them in tox. So whatever your flavor of benzo or whatever you like to use, start with those. If you start to see these symptoms like the tachycardia, the tremors, the agitation, this seems to be a hint that the seizure might be coming. My style practice is if I start to see this develop, I like to cut it off before it happens. So I'll give a little bit of benzo to turn them down a little bit. So I usually try like 1 to 2 milligrams of IV lorazepam or 2 to 5 milligrams of midazolam. This dose is small enough that whether it's the bupropion effect or you have a situational anxiety from someone, from being in the hospital under the circumstances of self-harm, you're not going to know the patient, but it's enough that in either way, it could be beneficial for these folks. If, refractory and these persistent seizures are really rare, if they do have them, benzos at one point are not going to work. This is a good time to segue into using barbs. I like phenobarb personally. Load them up with some phenobarb. And at this point, your patient is either heading to, if they're not already intubated, you can use propofol as a nice adjunctive to that as well. I will say, as far as seizures, I have one, caveat of like one thing to avoid. Avoid phenytoin at all costs in these situations because phenytoin has that, it has that sodium channel blockade effect. You have the diluent and the drug itself that may be causing some problems. So you're making a bad situation worse in the presence of a drug that's potentially very cardiac toxic. Anecdotally, I've had, a handful of cases in fellowship where the teams have used it in a toxic overdose ingestion. The patient arrests, and then you get the patient back. If they have like an EF of like 15 or 20, and it's permanent, and you're just blown away. And this is why in toxicology with any toxic overdose exposure for like almost 99% of the time, phenytoin is a no-no. As far as kind of monitoring and obsing these folks, if you're dealing with the formulations matter, and that's why the history is always important. If I have a patient that comes in and they're asymptomatic, I'll do probably about a 12-hour OBS time. If it's the XL formulation, I'll give them a 24-hour OBS time. That's because we've had seizures occur up to 24 hours after the XL formulation's been ingested. Basic monitoring parameters, vital signs, any kind of CNS excitation, like we talked about the tremors, the agitation, all that stuff, and any kind of seizures, get them on a cardiac monitor, get an EKG as well. Always get I always harp on this too, get an acetaminophen and a salicylate level and a pregnancy test if you have a woman of childbearing age. I can't tell you how many times I've had a double whammy from all three of those things. They happen when you have these intentional ingestions. And just, keep in mind that, if you have this OBS period, once that patient becomes symptomatic, they are now in your care until they are not symptomatic. That's a big thing. And that's the big question I get a lot from ED docs and people on the floor. How long do I have to watch until they are not symptomatic once they become symptomatic? But, if you have a patient, in your OBS period at the end of it, they look good. They're generally, medically clear from that standpoint if you've had no symptoms with those formulations in that time period. And I usually, if it's an intentional ingestion, I always try to make sure to get behavioral health and psych involved to make sure the patient's evaluated before they go home because we want to try to avoid this from happening again.
Perfect. Well, again, I think you kind of hit all this in the L-Butrin episode. It's going to definitely be down for us, but it seems to be a lot of different stuff to consider. We talked about ECMO, we talked about labs, We talked about just getting lipids and doing all the things we can to get a good history. I think that's something we should probably start doing a little bit more. It's just an ED pharmacy and just in general getting a better history. But any closing words for you?
Man, just like I said, history is always important. It's going to matter for the formulation on these folks. If they get seizing, GABA A, hit it. And then if you're thinking about, we talked about GI decontamination. If you think you have those big ingestions, call poison control. We're there 24/7. We're more than happy to kind of help assess what's going on with your patient, and we can help guide those therapies if they need to be used.
Perfect. Well, I thank you for coming on. Everything's going to be in the show notes, guys. And we're going to close out the same way we close every episode, guys. You don't have to be a pharmacist. You have to work in the ED. But everything you do, make sure you pharm so hard.